At exactly 0214 hours on February 28, 2026, the USS Frank E. Peterson, Jr., an Arleigh Burke-class guided missile destroyer operating at flank speed in the northern Arabian Sea, received the execute order that had been 47 days in the making. The vertical launch system hatches on her forward deck cracked open in sequence, one after another, and a column of fire erupted from the sea surface as the first Block V Tomahawk land attack missile, TLAM, left its canister at 880 km per hour, banked northwest, and disappeared into the black sky over the Gulf of Oman. It was not alone. In the same 90-second window, VLS cells were popping open on USS Delbert D. Black, on USS Thomas Hudner, on USS Curtis Wilbur. From the submerged launch tubes of at least one Ohio-class SSGN lurking 150 meters beneath the surface. Across the breadth of the combined U.S.-Israeli strike package, dozens of Tomahawks clawed upward into the night, each one carrying a 450-kilogram penetrator warhead and a GPS inertial guidance package capable of threading a window at 1,500 kilometers range. This was the opening salvo of Operation Epic Fury, and it was the beginning of a countdown that Pentagon planners are watching with ice-cold dread. Because every one of those missiles that left its canister that night was not just a weapon. It was a subtraction. A number falling on a classified spreadsheet inside the Joint Staff's Munitions Directorate. A number that, 4 weeks later, has dropped by at least 850, and is still falling. What you are about to see is the real crisis behind the headlines. Not the fires over Tehran. Not the strike footage. Not the press conferences. The real crisis is a number. A shrinking number. And the men who understand what that number means are losing sleep tonight. At 0347 hours on March 1st, inside the Nimitz-class carrier USS Abraham Lincoln's Combat Information Center, 200 nautical miles southwest of Bandar Abbas, the strike operations officer was staring at a Tomahawk expenditure rate log that had crossed a threshold nobody wanted to talk about out loud. 168 Tomahawks. Gone. In the first 100 hours. That figure, confirmed by analysts at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, represented a burn rate that exceeded every planning model the U.S. Navy had prepared for a conflict of this type. In Operation Iraqi Freedom in 2003, the U.S. fired roughly 800 Tomahawks across the entire invasion. The Iran campaign matched that expenditure rate in less than 16 days. Simultaneously, 1,200 kilometers to the northwest, in a hardened intelligence relay facility outside Latakia, Syria, Russian GRU analysts were doing the same math. They had their own spreadsheet, their own countdown, and they were watching every number change in real time. Because what the United States did not fully appreciate until too late, until the Washington Post published the intelligence assessment on March 6, was that Russia was not a passive observer in this conflict. Russian intelligence had been feeding Tehran something worth more than missiles: coordinates. The precise GPS positions of American surface warships and aircraft operating across the Middle East theater. Real-time. Encrypted. Continuous. 3 senior U.S. officials confirmed the intelligence to the Washington Post. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth was asked directly on CBS's 60 Minutes whether Russia was providing targeting data to Iran. His answer was 4 words. "We're tracking everything." That is either a reassurance or a warning. Possibly both. But the targeting intelligence was only part of what Moscow was extracting from Operation Epic Fury. Because Russia did not just want Iran to survive this conflict. Russia wanted to learn. And every Tomahawk that left a U.S. VLS canister was a data point being recorded, analyzed, and filed for future reference. The Khayyam satellite, a Russian Canopus V Earth observation platform transferred to Iran in 2022, was already imaging U.S. carrier strike group positions in the Gulf. Chinese ISR vessels had deployed to the region in early February under the cover of maritime exercises, carrying sensors calibrated to record the radar, electronic, and acoustic signatures of Block V Tomahawk launches. The YLC-8B anti-stealth radar, a Chinese UHF band system supplied to Iran, was tracking the flight profiles of inbound TLAMs, feeding that data directly to Beijing's missile defense engineers. Every American shot was a lesson. And the classroom was getting very expensive. At $3.5 million per unit, the current Raytheon production cost, 850 Tomahawks represents a strike package worth just under $3 billion. Incinerated in 28 days. And here is where the strategic mathematics become genuinely alarming. The The U.S. Navy estimated total Tomahawk inventory at roughly 3,100 missiles when Operation Epic Fury began on February 28. 850 expended in 4 weeks means the arsenal has already fallen by 27%. Mark Cancian, senior advisor at SIZE, ran the numbers bluntly. That would be about a quarter of the total inventory and would leave a large gap for a conflict in the Western Pacific. His timeline for replenishment was equally direct. It would take several years. To rebuild what 4 weeks of combat consumed. At 1,142 hours on March 15, aboard the guided missile submarine USS Michigan, one of 4 Ohio-class SSGNs converted from ballistic missile platforms to carry up to 154 Tomahawks across 22 repurposed launch tubes, the weapons officer completed a tube-by-tube inventory check and submitted his report to ComSubPac. The figures were classified, but the trajectory was not difficult to read. Simultaneously, in the Raytheon facility in Tucson, Arizona, the only factory on Earth that manufactures Tomahawks, production engineers were running models on what it would take to accelerate output. The current contracted rate for fiscal year 2026, 57 missiles. Not 570. Not 5,700. 57. Fewer than 5 per month. The defense industrial base, gutted by 2 decades of peacetime procurement philosophy, could surge to perhaps 600 per year under emergency contracting. But 2 to 4 years from contract to delivery. That is the production lag for the most critical long-range precision strike weapon in the American arsenal. Trump posted on Truth Social that defense companies had agreed to quadruple production. Raytheon announced framework agreements. Speaker Mike Johnson confirmed discussions on a $50 billion emergency supplemental defense funding request. The words were right. But the industrial timelines were immovable. You cannot quadruple a production line in 90 days when the components, the turbofan engines, the terrain contour matching guidance chips, the penetrator casings, each have their own lead times, their own supplier chains, their own bottlenecks. Senator Lisa Murkowski said what many were thinking but few would say on the record. The White House spent years telling Ukraine it could not provide more weapons because doing so risked depleting U.S. stockpiles. Given the level of stockpiles that U.S. forces are spending every day, she said, I think we all have reason to ask serious questions about how we are managing munitions. But it was not only Tomahawks. At 0318 hours on March 18, CENTCOM's Air Defense Watch Team flagged an anomaly in the THAAD battery status reports from Al Udeid Air Base, Qatar. The Terminal High Altitude Area Defense System, America's most capable upper-tier missile interceptor, had been firing at an unsustainable rate since day one of Epic Fury as Iranian ballistic missiles poured across the Gulf toward American installations and partner nations. The numbers from the Payne Institute assessment were staggering. 198 THAAD interceptors expended in the first 16 days of operations alone. At roughly 40% of pre-conflict inventory. In 16 days. A size analysis confirmed that no new THAAD interceptors had been delivered to U.S. inventory since July 2023, due to budget constraints and production bottlenecks at Lockheed Martin's facility in Camden, Arkansas. Current production capacity, 96 interceptors per year. A framework agreement announced January 29 aimed to expand that to 400. Eventually. The future tense doing a lot of work in a sentence about a crisis that is happening right now. Defense analysts call this magazine depth. The concept is simple. A gun is only as effective as the number of rounds in its magazine. When the magazine empties, the gun becomes a club. America's most advanced air defense and strike systems were emptying their magazines in real time, and the industrial base producing the ammunition was running at the pace of a peacetime economy. At 0557 hours on March 22, inside the Pentagon's earring, the Joint Staff convened an emergency review of what defense planners call theater optionality, the military's ability to simultaneously prosecute a conflict in one theater without hollowing out its capacity to respond in another. The scenario that kept appearing in the classified modeling runs, Taiwan, or the South China Sea, or the Korean Peninsula. Any of the 3 pressure points where China or North Korea might choose to act while American missile magazines were being drained in the Persian Gulf. The Intelligence Community Assessment released by Director of National Intelligence Tulsi Gabbard on March 26 put it in language designed to alarm. China, Russia, and North Korea see the United States as a strategic competitor and potential adversary. And China was not just watching the Iran war from a distance. Chinese vessels in the Gulf were conducting ISR operations against U.S. fleet movements. Chinese satellite imagery of American carrier strike group positions had been published by Chinese companies on open-source platforms. The People's Liberation Army's rocket force was running its own after-action assessments of every Tomahawk strike profile it could intercept. Catherine Thompson, a senior fellow at the Cato Institute, stated it with surgical precision: the United States is only equipped to support a one-war planning construct. One war, one theater, one magazine. And the magazine was 850 rounds lighter than it was 4 weeks ago. Simultaneously, China was finalizing what Reuters reported as a near-complete deal to supply Iran with 50 cm 302 supersonic anti-ship missiles, the export variant of the YJ-12 carrier killer. Mach 3. Sea skimming. Reaction window. Seconds. The USS Abraham Lincoln and the USS Gerald R. Ford were both operating within its engagement envelope. At 0819 hours on March 27, the Washington Post published its investigation. The headline landed in every capital from Moscow to Beijing to Tehran within minutes. More than 850 Tomahawks fired. A quarter of the inventory. Pentagon officials alarmed. Internal discussions about relocating missiles from the Indo-Pacific to keep the Iran campaign supplied. That last detail, relocating missiles from the Indo-Pacific, was the one that stopped senior planners cold. Because pulling Tomahawks from Pacific theater submarines and surface ships to refill Middle East magazines did not create missiles. It created a gap. A gap in the deterrent posture against China. A gap that Beijing's analysts, feeding data from their Gulf ISR vessels and their Khayyam satellite feeds and their Whale C-8B radar logs, were measuring with extraordinary precision. Russia's Vladimir Putin personally denied to Donald Trump that Moscow was sharing intelligence with Iran. The denial was noted, then set aside. Because the architecture of what Russia and China had built around Iran over the preceding 3 years did not require Putin to pick up a phone. It ran on its own. Satellite feeds. Encrypted data links. Prepositioned radar systems. A signals intelligence infrastructure that had been designed, from the start, to function exactly the way it was functioning right now. The Financial Times source who had watched the Tomahawk expenditure data mount across 4 weeks of Operation Epic Fury said what the classified briefings would not. The Navy will feel this for years. One sentence. The weight of a strategic miscalculation measured in years. Now hear this: the Tomahawk is not just a missile. It is the architecture of American power projection. It is the reason U.S. presidents can strike targets in hardened, defended airspace without sending pilots into the threat envelope of S-400 systems and Chinese HQ-9B batteries. It is the weapon that lets Washington threaten consequence without threatening lives, American lives. When that weapon becomes scarce, the calculus changes. The options narrow. The risk equation shifts from a cruise missile leaving a canister 1,000 miles away to a manned aircraft pushing through an air defense network that Russia helped Iran build and China helped Iran maintain. What happens when the magazine runs dry mid-campaign? The answer is not a press release from Caroline Leavitt. The answer is a classified decision memo arriving on Pete Hegseth's desk asking whether the next target package gets hit with a precision standoff weapon, or whether it gets hit at all. The Russians understand this arithmetic better than almost anyone. They ran out of precision missiles in Ukraine. They watched their own magazine depth collapse in 2022. They adapted. Slowly. Painfully. By pivoting to Iranian Shahid drones, to North Korean artillery shells, to whatever the industrial base could push out the door. They learned something from that experience that they are now watching America learn in real time. In modern high-intensity conflict, munitions are not a budget line. They are a strategic resource. And strategic resources can be spent faster than they can be made. Moscow is watching. Beijing is taking notes. And somewhere in a classified facility in Tucson, Arizona, a production engineer is staring at a build schedule for 57 Tomahawk missiles and trying to figure out how to explain to SecNav that the math does not work. The countdown on America's most critical magazine is not a hypothetical. It is a number. It updates every time a VLS hatch opens over the Gulf. And right now, in March 2026, that number is going in exactly one direction. Down. What do you think? Can the U.S. industrial base rearm fast enough before this conflict forces a decision no administration wants to make? Comment below. And if you want to understand why the Strait of Hormuz and the South China Sea may be the next chapter of the same story, watch the next video.